I have no reply to this other than to say that I don't know what a state, mental or physical, could possibly be if it were not an attribute. And I don't see how an attribute can possibly avoid being a necessarily existent thing. Now here's an argument for the existence of attributes being necessary. You might find it an amusing exercise to go through it and find the hidden assumption of serious actualism in the argument. I'll just skip the argument. My extreme ideas about ontology also imply that the falsity or the mere vacuous truth of the so-called identity thesis, the thesis that every mental event is a physical event. They have this implication because they imply that there are no events of any description, either mental or physical. I must point out that the thesis that there are no events is obviously not the same thesis as the thesis that substances never gain or lose properties or never begin or cease to stand in certain relations. I grant the substances and the properties and the relations, but I see no reason to affirm the existence of items denoted by phrases like the acquisition of the property hunger by the substance Socrates, or the substances Socrates and Xantippe coming to stand in the relation marriage. I have recently read the draft of a paper by a very famous philosopher that contains the following argument. When a cold poker becomes hot, that is a change, and therefore changes exist. And I'm willing to say that the countdown change is more or less synonymous with event. This argument, however, is formally invalid, even if its conclusion is true. It's formally invalid because its premise contains a pronoun, the demonstrative pronoun that has no antecedent. The argument is there's just nothing for that to refer back to. It doesn't refer back to anything that's mentioned. The argument is precisely analogous to its formal validity is precisely analogous to the formal invalidity of this poker is hot and that's a property, therefore there are properties. That argument has a true conclusion, but it's nevertheless invalid. The thesis that there are, speaking strictly and philosophically, no events obviously has consequences for the philosophy of causation, since many treatments of causation involve quantification over events, but I'll put off talking about that till later. Let's now turn to the topic of Cartesian or Platonic dualism, substance dualism. I regard that thesis as false, but not because it's in conflict with my extreme ontological ideas or my odd ideas about the mental-physical opposition. Cartesian dualism is false, I say, but perfectly intelligible. I'm less happy about the intelligibility of property dualism. How can that thesis be stated? Perhaps like this. There are physical and non-physical properties. Mental properties are among the non-physical ones. But that proposal raises a difficult question. What are physical and non-physical properties? We've seen what mental properties are, properties that entail thought or sensation, but what are physical properties? And more to the point, what are non-physical properties? Non-physical properties cannot be understood as properties that are not physical, properties that are not physical things or physical objects, for in that reading of non-physical property, all properties are non-physical properties. Are non-physical properties then properties that entail the property of being a non-physical thing? That is, properties that can belong only to non-physical things? That would be a definition parallel to our definition of mental properties. Mental properties are properties that can belong only to sapient or sentient things. Well, certainly not according to those philosophers who profess and call themselves property dualists. For one of the core theses of property dualism is that physical things not only can have, but do have non-physical properties. Some physical things have mental properties, and mental properties, according to property dualism, are non-physical properties. Might a non-physical property be a property that does not entail the property of being a physical thing, but is consistent with that property? This is a less obviously objectionable proposal, but it has the consequence that the property thinking about Vienna is a non-physical property only if it is possible for there to be a non-physical thing that thinks about Vienna. If the proposal is accepted, therefore, property dualism will entail the metaphysical possibility of substance dualism, or of idealism, perhaps, and that is an unwanted consequence of the definition. Property dualists will not be happy about being committed to the thesis that it's metaphysically possible for there to be immaterial or non-physical thinkers. It's not that they're committed to denying that thesis, but they'd certainly prefer not to have to affirm it as a logical consequence of their theory. I've been unable to find in print a definition of non-physical property that seems to me both to be intelligible and likely actually to capture what property dualists mean by the phrase. I therefore, at one point, adapted the simple expedient of asking selected property dualists what they meant by non-physical property. And here's what I learned when I subjected David Chalmers to an extended line of Socratic questioning. A non-physical property is a property of some physical things such that the pattern of its instantiation among physical things does not supervene on the totality of the distribution of matter and radiation in space-time. Property dualism can therefore be framed in these words. In any pair of possible worlds in which matter and radiation are distributed in space-time in exactly the same way, every physical being, and in particular every living organism in one of those worlds, will have a counterpart in the other world. And there will be pairs of same distribution worlds such that an organism in one of them and its counterpart in the other will differ in their mental properties. Take you, for example, you as you are in the actual world. There are worlds in which matter and radiation are distributed just as they are in the actual world, in which your counterpart has different mental properties from yours. Indeed, there are same distribution worlds in which you have a counterpart who is a zombie, a creature whose behavior and physiological and anatomical structure are the same as yours, but who has no mental properties at all, a creature that neither thinks nor feels. I should remark that my use of the word counterpart is not supposed to bring David Lewis's modal ontology to mind. The counterparts that figure here, your counterpart in the world may or may not be you. The definition of property dualism is neutral with respect to that. Okay, that's a thesis I can understand. I'm not sure why anyone would want to call it a form of dualism, but I won't go into that question. In any case, whatever the reason for the thesis, I reject it. This rejection, like my rejection of substance dualism, is not a consequence of my extreme ontological ideas, although it probably does reflect the fact that Chalmers and I have very different ideas about modal epistemology. I simply think that it's false. It seems quite evident to me that if I am, as I suppose myself to be, composed entirely of quarks and electrons, then my intrinsic properties supervene on the distribution of matter and radiation in space-time, and necessarily so. That is, for any other organism in any other world, the same would be the case. More generally, if God's creation is entirely physical, then once he's ordained a distribution of matter and radiation in space-time, there's nothing more for him to do, qua creator at least. If he has ordained the actual distribution of matter and radiation in space-time, he has thereby caused every proposition about created things to be true if it is true, or false if it is false. The truth of the following propositions, for example. There are over 500,000 species of beetles. It's easier for a German to learn Dutch than it is for an Italian. Most mathematicians do not regard either mathematical logic or statistics as real mathematics. Bratislava and Vienna are closer to each other than any two other capital cities. Some ancestral Africans, that is, some human beings, all of whose human ancestors were born in Africa, are more closely related to most Swedes than they are to some other ancestral Africans. The truth of all, those are all true propositions, at least as far as I know, and their truth is a metaphysically necessary consequence of the distribution of matter and radiation in space-time that we, according to this theological intuition pump, we're imagining that God has ordained. I just think that I don't see how everything could avoid being supervenient. If creation is entirely physical, I don't see how every truth about creation could avoid being supervenient on the distribution of matter and radiation in space-time, and therefore truths about the metal as well. But these two metaphysical theses that I reject, theses concerning the relation between the mental and the physical, substance dualism and property dualism so defined, are both consistent with my odd ideas about the relation between the mental and the physical. Now my very odd ideas about causation. And these ideas can be summed up in just a few words. Causal relations exist. Many